Welcome to the Year 10 lesson for Terror in Nazi Germany. Now, you should already have the following title in your book from the team's introduction, and that should be How Did Hitler Use Terror to Control Nazi Germany? You should be doing this on pieces of paper and then keeping it inside your black folders. If you've got it at school, then we can put it back in when you're back here. If you've already got them at home, great, you can put it in and organise your notes as you go along. Now remember, the idea of this is to make sure that everybody can do the lesson at their own pace. You need to make sure you're pausing the video at the relevant points and doing the activities and then pressing play again, where we'll be going through the answers after each little bit, just like we would in lesson if you were really here with us. Lesson today is part of a wider topic of how did the Nazis keep control of Germany for those years that they were in power between 1933 and 1945. Now today we are going to be looking at terror, and we're going to be thinking about groups like the Gestapo, the secret police, the SS, who were originally Hitler's bodyguards and then evolved into being basically a terror organisation in Nazi Germany. And we're also going to think about concentration camps. Now, when people think about how did Hitler stay in power, they often think about terror, and they think about all of the different things that the Nazis did to scare people into staying loyal to them. However, we need to be aware that this wasn't the only way that the Nazis stayed in power. They were also in power for so long because of their use of propaganda. They had managed to convince people that they were good for Germany, that they were benefiting ordinary people. And they convinced them through the different means like radio, newspapers, even things like education. All of it was used as propaganda. And as a result of propaganda and some of their social policies that were liked by ordinary people, they were then popular. And because they were popular, people wanted them to stay in power. So there are three different reasons why the Nazis were able to stay in power for so long. And that is because of terror, propaganda, and the fact that they did things to improve the lives of some German people, and therefore they were very popular. To start the lesson off, I'd like you to watch a documentary clip which is going to give you an introduction to the terror state. Now you can see the name of the video there. I've also put a link to this on Show My Homework, and also at the bottom of this YouTube clip that you're watching now, in the description there's a link to it as well. Now this video is 23 minutes long. I don't want you to watch the whole 23 minutes. I just want you to watch from 8 minutes 50 to 18 minutes 05. The timings are put on the bottom here that you can see. Now, this documentary is all about what it was like for ordinary people in Germany. You can see this woman here is going to be on the documentary. She's an American woman living in Germany at this point. Now, up to this point in the video, the bit that you're not going to watch, it's shown us how she's experienced the positives of Nazi Germany. She's seen what it's like for some people that have benefited from Nazi policies. For instance, some workers who had lost their jobs in the Great Depression, they now got their jobs back as a result of the Nazi employment policies. So far she's seen the positives. And the rest of the video that you're going to watch, that 10-minute clip, is about her realising the reality of Nazi Germany and about the negatives. Now, you don't have to write down points if you don't want to, but you could make some bullet pointed notes about what problems there were in the terror state of Nazi Germany. So pause this YouTube video now, open that video in a new tab and watch just that 10-minute clip of it, and then come back to this video to be able to carry on with the rest of the lesson. From the video, you should have seen about how Nazi Germany became basically a terror state or a police state, one where you had to be very careful about what you said. They had common terms like speak through a flower, basically only say nice things. Otherwise, you could get arrested, you could lose your job, and you could even end up in a concentration camp. Now, today we want you to build up a good set of notes about what terror was like and how it was used to control the people. You're going to be looking at 4 different areas that we can see listed on this screen: concentration camps, the SS, Gestapo, and the police and courts. Now, by the end of the lesson, you want to have some detailed bullet-pointed notes on each of those 4 sections. Now, we're going to give you all of the description, but if you can, try and challenge yourself a little bit to think about why would these different aspects of terror help make Hitler's position even more secure. That will really help you get to those grade 7 to 9s. So make sure you're making lots of notes as we're going through this. You need to pause it regularly in order to give yourself time to be able to make some really strong notes. First section you're going to need to make notes on is concentration camps. I'm going to read through the information from the textbook scan with you, and then once I've done that, I want you to put a subheading of concentration camps, pick out the main points that you think are important, and write them as a series of bullet points underneath. So concentration camps were the Nazis' ultimate sanction against their own people. They were set up almost as soon as Hitler took power. The first concentration camps in 1933 were simply makeshift prisons in disused factories and warehouses. For instance, the first one at Dachau was like that as well. Soon these were then purpose-built. These camps were usually in isolated rural areas and run by the SS Death's Heads units. Prisoners were forced to do hard labour. Food was very limited and prisoners suffered harsh discipline, beatings and random executions. By the late 1930s, deaths in the camps became increasingly common and very few people emerged alive from them. Jews, socialists, communists, trade unions, churchmen and anybody else brave enough to criticise the Nazis could end up there. Now just be aware these are quite different to the extermination camps that they set up from 1942 to murder Jewish people. These are completely separate and these were created first of all in 1933. So pause this video here and start to make some bullet pointed notes of what you think are the really key points to know about concentration camps. You're looking for at least 5 points really here. You've now got the notes from the textbook that you need, but on this side we've got a few extra details that would be great for you to add to your existing notes on the concentration camps. And we've already seen that the concentration camps are established as soon as the Nazis come to power. Now remember that Hitler doesn't become the Chancellor until the 30th of January 1933, and yet by early March 1933 they've established their first concentration camp. The first concentration camp was created in Dachau in the south of Germany in the state of Bavaria, very close to the border with Austria. It's definitely worth adding the name of it down into your books, because if you can put those kind of little details in, it really impresses examiners, and lots of you are going for those top grades of 7 to 9. So they established these very quickly, and they did this because it helped them consolidate their position. You've already learned about how Hitler became dictator through a series of different events, things like the Reichstag fire, things like the Night of the Long Knives as well that happened later on in June 1934. So these concentration camps that start in March 1933 but carry on being created throughout the 1930s, these helped establish his position even more because they terrified opponents into supporting the Nazis. They would arrest you in the middle of the night, transfer you to one of these concentration camps, and then they might release you either a few months or a few years later. The idea being that you would then tell other people your experience and what it was like being in one of those labour camps, and therefore those other people would also make sure that they towed the line and that they didn't criticise the Nazis or join a trade union or do anything else that was seen as illegal. So concentration camps are a really important form of terror because they make the German people feel too afraid to express any kind of criticism or opposition. So it's definitely worth adding this to the bottom of your notes because this is the kind of thing you need to say to get those top grades and to link it to different questions about why this was an effective form of terror. So add those couple of bits that I've highlighted in red and then we can move on to the next section. The next group you need to know about is the SS. Now, the SS are very famous for being fanatically loyal to Hitler. What I'm going to ask you to do is just to listen as I talk through this textbook scan, and then once I've done that, you're going to do the same thing and make some bullet pointed notes under a subheading, this time of the SS. So first of all, you can see how Himmler was in charge of all the different branches of the SS. This is Himmler in this picture here, one of the top Nazis. You can see in this diagram as well about all the different subdivisions of the SS and what they were in charge of. The SS is sometimes called by historians a state within a state. The idea being it was basically so powerful it was almost like another government within Nazi Germany and their government itself. So let's look at what the textbook says about it. So the SS was formed in 1925 from fanatics loyal to Hitler. Before that, there had been the SA that had been the group of the Nazi Party rather than being loyal to Hitler himself. After virtually destroying the SA in 1934 in the Night of the Long Knives, the SS then grew into a huge organisation with many different responsibilities. It was led by Heinrich Himmler. The SS men were of course Aryans, were highly trained and totally loyal to Hitler. Under Himmler, the SS had primary responsibility for destroying opposition to Nazism and carrying out the racial policies of the Nazis, basically carrying out the Holocaust. Two important subdivisions of the SS were the Death's Head units and the Waffen-SS. The Death's Head units were responsible for the concentration camps and the slaughter of the Jews. The Waffen-SS were special SS armoured regiments who fought alongside the regular army. So here is a picture of the Waffen-SS you can see in their uniforms. Now what I'd like you to do is pause here and make some more bullet pointed notes about what you can learn about the SS. So by now you should have the basics that you need to know on the SS. I'd like you to add just a few more details to your notes to make sure that you're exam ready for this. So the first thing that I'd like you to add is that by 1939 the SS had 250,000 members. You need to understand this is the biggest terror organisation. It's much bigger than the Gestapo, the secret police that we'll look at next. Now these members aren't just ordinary German people. Not everybody could go and join the SS even if they wanted to. They were supposed to be ruthless, but they also had to be fiercely loyal to Hitler. As well as that, they had to be racially pure and physically strong. If you wanted to be in the SS, you couldn't even have flat feet or asthma or even have ever had something like a filling. You had to be somebody that was completely racially pure. If you wanted to be a member of the SS, you had to prove your heritage back until 1850. If you wanted to be an officer, it had to go back as high as 1750. So over 150 years, almost 200 years worth of your genetic history had to be proved. Even if you wanted to get married and you're a member of the SS, you had to prove your wife's heritage back to that time as well. So the SS was seen as the kind of real incredible forces of Nazi Germany. They were seen as the people that were the most Aryan and the most loyal. And it was seen as an honour to be a member of the SS at this time. The person in charge of them we've already mentioned was Himmler. Himmler was an incredibly important and powerful Nazi. Some people argue that without people like Himmler, the Holocaust might not have happened. Concentration camps might not have been established in the same way that they were. So you want to make sure that you know that man's name. Now, the other thing I'd like you to add from this slide is about why this helps the Nazis stay in power. Remember, this is really important to get up to those grades 7 to 9. So I'd like you to add this bit here about how the Nazis tried to make the German people feel too afraid to express any kind of criticism or opposition. You might feel like that's quite similar to what you wrote about concentration camps, but of course these two are linked very much because the SS were in charge of the concentration camps. So write that down at the bottom of your SS section. So just pause the video here to add those notes if you haven't already. So now moving on to the third area of the Gestapo. Again, once I've gone through the information, pause it and make some bullet pointed notes about them. So the Gestapo, the secret state police, was the force which was perhaps the most feared by the ordinary German citizen. Under the command of Heydrich, Gestapo agents had sweeping powers. They could arrest citizens on suspicion and send them to concentration camps without trial or even explanation. Remember that Hitler had the power to be able to do this since the Reichstag fire, the day afterwards when he passed those emergency decrees which suspended civil rights and said that they could arrest people without evidence. So that's still in place the whole time the Nazis are in power. Modern research has shown that the Germans thought the Gestapo were much more powerful than they actually were. As a result, many ordinary Germans informed on each other because they thought the Gestapo would find out anyway. So I'd like to pause it here and make some bullet pointed notes. So you've got the basics on the Gestapo, but now we need to add more detail. Now you've already heard on the video the term speak through a flower, and if you haven't already added that, please do add that little common phrase. This shows us that ordinary people in Germany were scared to express any kind of criticism or opposition because they didn't know who was a Gestapo agent and who was a Gestapo informer. There are examples of people being out in restaurants and making a joke about Hitler, saying, for instance, that he's not very intelligent, or making a joke that he's not, had very good policies for Germany. Any little comment like that could lead to an arrest. And there are examples of people in cafes making jokes and being arrested within 20 minutes because somebody had gone and phoned the Gestapo. So people were genuinely terrified, and for good reason, of the power of the Gestapo. Remember that their job was to find enemies of the state. They could do this through loads of different ways. They could open your mail, like we can see in this picture here. They could do things like tapping telephones. They could collect information from informers, and nobody knew who they were. They were terrifying because they were the secret police. When they thought you'd done something wrong, they can arrest you, because since the Reichstag fire, they've had the power to be able to arrest and detain anybody, even if they don't have any evidence on you. They can then torture you into a confession, and then once you've confessed, they would then imprison you in a concentration camp without having a trial to go there first. So they were genuinely terrifying. However, historians have shown that actually there weren't as many Gestapo agents as the German people believed. There was only 20,000 people in it before 1939, and the maximum it ever gets up to is 30,000. So I definitely want you to add this statistic down, because it shows you that they're actually relatively small, especially in comparison to the SS, who had 250,000 members by 1939. So this is much, much smaller. However, Gestapo aren't working alone. They are really dependent on their network of informers, and there are about 160,000 of them. Some people are motivated by loyalty to the state and just love the Nazis so much they couldn't bear it when somebody made a joke or criticised them, and therefore out of loyalty they would inform on them. But sometimes people used it for their own reasons. So for instance, if you had a personal grudge against somebody, I don't know, your neighbour had done something wrong to you, you could make up a lie and inform on them and then report it to the Gestapo. This kind of thing happened so much that the Gestapo later on actually had to announce that they were going to punish anybody that falsely accused somebody else. So it shows you the extent of which people were informing on each other in Nazi Germany. Remember, you could be informed on for anything, a joke, criticising the Nazis, or even doing things like not saluting or saying Heil Hitler. All these different things could lead to you being arrested and spending time in a concentration camp. So pause the video here and add the sections that you haven't already covered in your notes from the textbook. We're now on to the final section of your note making, and this is about the police and the courts. So reading through the textbook scan, the police and courts also helped to prop up the Nazi dictatorship. Top jobs in local police forces were given to high-ranking Nazis reporting to Himmler. As a result, the police added political snooping to their normal law and order role. They were, of course, under strict instructions to ignore crimes committed by Nazi agents. Similarly, the Nazis controlled magistrates, judges and the courts, which meant that opponents of Nazism rarely received a fair trial. And you can see an image there of a judge doing the Heil Hitler salute. You've got the key points down now. What we're going to do is go through and talk about it in a little bit more detail than the textbook did. So first of all, the police still existed in Nazi Germany. They existed, though, alongside the SA at first, which became more irrelevant after the Night of Long Knives in June 1934. They also have the SS, and there's also the Gestapo, the secret state police. So the police still exist, but they basically changed their role because now they are relying on a network of informers. They're doing things like ignoring certain crimes if they're committed by a high-ranking Nazi or a member of the Gestapo or the SS. But they are collecting more evidence and information on ordinary German people. Now, the police weren't the only problem. The courts were another big issue. And this is a massive issue because it meant that nobody had the right to a fair trial. Now, in today's society, in Germany or in England, if you committed a crime, you would end up having a fair trial where you would have a lawyer representing you. If you couldn't afford one, the state would appoint one for you. You would be able to give evidence. You would be able to basically ask to be released if they couldn't give any evidence against you. So now courtroom trials are much more fair. At this point, under the Nazis, you would have a Nazi judge, somebody that had sworn loyalty to the party, who would be deciding whether you were guilty or innocent. But also, quite often people weren't given a lawyer. And even if they were given a lawyer, that lawyer had been scared into silence and intimidated by the Nazis. So people's trials, rather than taking the months that they take now, sometimes lasted less than 10 minutes for them to make people go in, tell them what crime they committed, give them no chance to speak, and then sentence them. And we're not just talking about people going to concentration camps here. The Nazis also used the death penalty a lot. So you can see here that the number of crimes punishable by death increased from 3 in 1933, before the Nazis came to power, to 46 by 1943. You could actually be executed for telling an anti-Nazi joke, having a sexual relationship with a Jew, or listening to a foreign radio station like the BBC. So the police and courts were totally taken over by the Nazi terror state, and it was terrifying because there was no feeling of justice or a fair trial, and therefore if you were accused of something, there was nothing to save you from your fate in Nazi Germany. So pause the video here and add any extra information you haven't already got. I just want to pause here for a second to say that obviously living in this police state of Nazi Germany was quite terrifying if you're an opponent of the Nazis. If you were somebody that didn't like them, you didn't fit into their ideals, it would have been a really difficult time for you. Let's say if you were a socialist, you supported the SPD, or you were a communist, or you were somebody that was a trade unionist, this would have been absolutely terrifying, and all of these different forms of terror could be used against you. However, remember, for the large majority of people, they liked the Nazis. They thought that they had good policies, and the majority of people felt that terror was kind of necessary for the people that deserved it. So we look now, obviously, at the Nazi state as this terrible police state that was horrible for German people. But remember, for the majority of Germans, they actually supported it, and they didn't mind this because they felt it was necessary for the opponents of the regime in order for them to create this strong Germany. Nonetheless, let's move on to thinking about your opinion and kind of summing up and tying up today's lesson. So what I'd like you to do is to write a paragraph where you're thinking about which form of terror would be the most effective form of terror in Nazi Germany. So I want you to think about which form was most effective. Do you think it's the SS? Would you say it's the concentration camps? Would you have said the Gestapo was most effective, or the control over the police and courts? So I want you to think about which aspect of terror, which form of terror was the most effective in keeping the Nazis in control. So pause the video and then make some notes maybe, and then you could write your paragraph afterwards, or you could just go straight into the paragraph, whatever you prefer. You've now reached the end of the work. Well done for doing so. If you've got anything else that's left, please do make sure you do those notes because you will need them in the future. And if you've got time, it would be great if you could write a little note on the Q&A box on Teams and tell me about which form of terror you said was most effective and why. It would just be good to kind of see your views on it, just like we would at the end of a normal lesson. Okay, well done.